Week 4 DraftKings slate is an absolute doozy. Loads of injury news, which is affecting things. But that just leaves us lots of room to capitalize. We've got loads to get through. I'm going to bring you 2 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, 5 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends who will look like great plays. I'm going to give you reasons you should be playing them and how you should be using them in your lineups. Let's go. CJ Stroud, 7,000 against Jacksonville Jaguars. I regularly get on CJ Stroud for the fact that his name outweighs his fantasy production at time. And he's the latest in the line of pocket passes that people become enamored with for his real life abilities. And he actually kind of struggles to keep up with the dual threats at the top of the fantasy points leaderboards a lot of the time. But this is one of those weeks where we absolutely should be targeting him. He's got loads of opportunity against the Jaguars defense that allow the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. According to fantasy points, Stroud receives a biggest boost among all quarterbacks this week for the opposing coverage grade. And that's based on the way that the Jags play man coverage at the highest rate in the league. Stroud boasts a 75% completion rate against man coverage. And in 2023, when Stroud played against the Jags, he was QB4 and QB10. Loads of reasons why Stroud can go off this week. I think I prefer him for tournaments over cash games this week. I don't think that you need to exclude him from your cash game pool, but in tournaments, stacking him with Nico Collins, Steph Diggs, with Tank Dell out, condenses that passing tree. And with the inadequacies of the Jags, I'm not sure you need to force a bring back, but if I was going to do so, it'd either be one at the budget tight end, who we'll get to in a bit, or Christian Kirk. Kyler Murray, 6,800 against the Washington Commanders. When I went into my Fantasy Pros expert consensus rankings this week and ranked Kyler Murray as the QB1 overall, I thought I was going to be going out on a limb, but then loaded up. The expert consensus is aligned. Kyler Murray is the QB1 this week because he gets the pure nut matchup playing against the league leaders in fantasy points allowed through the passing game, the Commanders. They've allowed 67 points through the passing game, 11 more than the next nearest team. They've also allowed the most receiving fantasy points and the most receiving touchdowns at 9. Kyler's the only quarterback to rush for 45 plus yards in all games. This game, absolute must start Kyler Murray, and I'm going to be looking at him in both cash games as well as tournaments. In tournaments, I think there's definitely ways we can build to get different, but it's just so hard to get away from Kyler Murray this week. We'll get to running backs in a second, but if this is your first time finding us here at Fantasy Sanctuary, we do Dynasty, we do Redraft, we do DFS, and we do Best Ball all year round. Hit the subscribe button so we can help you win. Brian Robinson, 6,100 against the Cardinals. Look, if Brian Robinson's on the main slate, then Brian Robinson should be in your player pool. The biggest hindrance to Brian Robinson has been Austin Eckler, who was ruled out this game on Wednesday this week. That's really early because of the concussion he suffered last week. Robinson, he had a disappointing 2.1 yards per carry against the Bengals defense. But the game, it was flowing through the passing game, so there wasn't necessarily the same need to rely on him like they have done in previous weeks. Robinson still found his way into the end zone. He's been a top 24 running back in each of the first 3 weeks. And this one, with an increase in volume, one of the highest over-unders of the slate, I'm absolutely going back to Brian Robinson again. In tournaments, I think that you can use Brian Robinson as leverage against Jaden Daniels, who's going to be quite a popular pick. But I wouldn't be afraid to stack Jaden Daniels with Brian Robinson together. Zack Moss, 5,900 against the Carolina Panthers. The Bengals, they are in no rush to turn this backfield over to Chase Brown. We heard plenty of chatter through the offseason that they really wanted Chase Brown to take over this backfield. It just hasn't happened yet. And until we see that, I'm completely fine just going back to Zack Moss again and again. Zack Moss has seen an average snap rate of 75%, 70% rushing share, 83% snap share inside the red zone. The Panthers allowed the 5th most fantasy points to the running back position, including 100-yard performances to both J.K. Dobbins and Alvin Kamara. They've given up touchdowns to 4 different running backs through 3 games. It just all sets up on paper to be a good game for Zack Moss, particularly if the Bengals can jump out to an early lead. I think that I would prefer to use Zack Moss as leverage away from Bengals stacks in tournaments, but he's a fine play in cash games too. Chuba Hubbard, 5,700 against the Bengals, and Chuba's $200 cheaper than Zack Moss. He's slowly wrestling away the RB1 duties from Miles Sanders, who in week 1, the Panthers really just wanted to feed Miles Sanders, and we saw how ineffective it was. Yes, Chuba Hubbard's probably not going to be the long-term RB1 because Jonathan Brooks could be returning in the coming weeks, but Hubbard, he's got an impressive 60% success rate in the running game, faced a Bengals defense that allowed the 7th most rushing yards, the 3rd most rushing touchdowns, and the 6th most rushing first downs. At this price, I think you can use Chuba Hubbard wherever you need to. If you're looking for little mini tournament game correlations, I'd lean towards Chuba Hubbard with T. Higgins, which will give you leverage away from Jamar Chase. Obviously, Jamar Chase is in a smash spot, but I think that people are going to gravitate to Jamar Chase and Diontae Johnson in this game. And if you do a little correlation between Chuba Hubbard and T. Higgins, that's probably going to provide you some nice leverage. Najee Harris, 5,600 against the Colts. Look, if you've watched my content, if you've read my content over on Fantasy Pros, you know I'm team Jaylen Warren. But the reality is Jaylen Warren's banged up, already been ruled out for this game. And this is a Steelers offense that is the second most run heavy on a per drop back basis. The Colts allow the second most rushing yards per game at 179. They've faced the first most inside the 5 rush attempts at 9, allowed the first most yards after contact at 253. Harris, he's had 62 touches through 3 games, and he hasn't cracked the top 12 just yet. But it feels like it's building. It feels like the Steelers' offense is starting to find their feet under Justin Fields. They're moving the ball well, and I think sooner or later, Najee Harris is going to have one of those games where if you didn't play him, you're just kicking yourself for it. Harris, the kind of bankable volume he's got, I think this is a cash game play more than a tournament play. In tournaments, I'd lean towards maybe Justin Fields and George Pickens as a little skinny stack. But here, I think the volume we're going to get, the matchup, it all adds up to a cash game play. Moving over to wide receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr., 7,500 against the Commanders. It is going to be a weekly auto play against the Commanders secondary. Like, you cannot ignore how bad the Commanders secondary are. He gets this cupcake of a matchup after back-to-back games with a 30% plus target share. He blew away that week 1 dud against the Bills. Now he's 4th in air yards across the league, 46.6 PPR points in the last 2 weeks. The Commanders have allowed top 12 performances to Jamar Chase, who was wide receiver 2, Malik Neighbors, who was wide receiver 3, Mike Evans, who was wide receiver 6, and Chris Godwin, who was wide receiver 8. They've allowed a league-leading 67.6 fantasy points through passing. Like I mentioned on the Kyler section, that's 11 more than any other team. I'm using Marvin Harrison everywhere. With Trey McBride being ruled out, his ownership's creeping up to around that 12% range. That is not enough to stop me wanting to play Marvin Harrison everywhere. Nico Collins, 7,200 versus Jacksonville. Aside from the fact that Nico Collins is a legit wide receiver 1 and the Texans got an incredible bargain on his contract, everything on paper that the Jags do on defense makes this an even better matchup for him. The Jags are a pass funnel defense. That means that they're really good against the run. They rank 13th in run defense DVOA, but they're 30th against the pass. So it's much easier to pass on the Jags than it is to run on them. The Jags, they play the most man and press coverage in the league. 2 schemes that Nico Collins absolutely feasts on. He boasts 3.8 yards per route run against man coverage. That trails only CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill over the last 2 seasons. I want to play Nico everywhere, but if you're looking at tournaments with Tank Dell missing out, you've got to be looking at Nico and CJ Stroud as your starting point for stacks. If you watched our weekly preview show, which is linked in the description down below, you'd have seen that Drake London was my start of the week against New Orleans Saints. And the anti-Drake London crowd, they're getting quieter and quieter each week as the signs of a breakout. They're there. They're becoming clearer and clearer. According to fantasypoints.com, Drake London was charted as forcing 7 missed tackles in all of 2023. Well, he's up to 5 missed tackles in 3 games already. And that's a result of this more creative offense that plays to his talents. They're running more horizontal breaking routes in the kind of Puka Nacua role under Zack Robinson, the new offensive coordinator. The Saints defense, they lead the league in yards allowed to these routes. Jacob Gibbs on Twitter pointed that one out. And Drake London, he's already equaled his touchdown total from 2023. The volume's been steady. Sooner or later, the explosion is coming, and I'm not going to be left behind on it. At 6,200, I think this is a really easy click in tournaments. I wouldn't exclude London from my cash plays, but I'm much preferring in tournaments where I'm leaning towards guys like Drake London who have that really high ceiling and might be a little under-owned because he hasn't exploded so far. George Pickens, 5,700 against the Colts. I already kind of hinted at it. I think that if you want to play George Pickens this week, it's an absolute fine way to approach this game. There'll be weeks where I don't even consider playing George Pickens because of how volatile he is, but the Colts defense, they rank 4th worst in DVOA against the pass, 26th against wide receiver 1s. They've allowed the 6th most fantasy points to the position, giving up top 13 weekly finishes to Rome Odunze, Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins. Pickens, he's only had 1 finish inside the top 40 wide receivers this far. But the matchup, it's promising. Justin Fields is completing 72% of his passes. And for tournaments only, I'd be completely fine with George Pickens. Diontae Johnson, 5,700 against the Bengals. It took one game with Andy Dalton for Diontae Johnson to have a career-high 122 receiving yards. And it makes sense because think back, Ben Roethlisberger was always just dinking and dunking the ball 2 yards past the line of scrimmage to Diontae Johnson. And then he's had Bryce Young. That's Diontae Johnson's 80th career game before he got up to 122 receiving yards. That's quite something. Johnson now has an even clearer runway with Adam Thielen. He landed on IR when he fell over in the end zone. The Bengals, they are hot off allowing a season high in fantasy points to Terry McLaurin. They rank 31st in DVOA against wide receiver ones, which suggests even though wide receivers haven't been erupting against them, sooner or later a massive performance could be coming, and I'm fine playing Diontae Johnson at this price in cash games and in tournaments. Almost done. 2 tight ends still to go, but hit that subscribe button. I know you're enjoying the content if you made it this far into the video. Brenton Strange, 3,100 against the Texans. We are absolutely punting the tight end position this week with the injuries at the top. Evan Ingram, he's missing out again with the hamstring injury. And while the Texans have allowed the 7th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position, they haven't really faced anyone. They faced Mo Ali Cox, Kylan Granson, the combination of Gerald Everett and Cole Kmet, who were tag teaming, Johnny Munt and Josh Oliver. Like, that's hardly a murderer's row of fantasy options. Strange, he's had 2 games without Evan Ingram, finishes a top 10 tight end in both games. He's absolutely fine for punting the position off. In tournaments, I generally want to use my tight end position correlated to the stack I'm building around, but I don't hate it if it opens up ceiling. But in cash games, I'd absolutely be going here. And another punt tight end, it is Elijah Higgins, 3,100 against the Commanders. With Trey McBride ruled out due to concussion, Elijah Higgins is going to have his chance to capitalize in a potential shootout. Higgins has seen 4 targets in 3 games, 41 yards and a touchdown. Second-year player who hasn't really had many chances to shine. But at this price, in this matchup, it's worth considering. I'd lean Brenton Strange in cash, but if you're looking at this game to build out tournament stacks, absolutely lean into Higgins as the tight end that you want to save salary on. Those are the 13 DFS plays that I want to build around this week. Let me know which stacks you're interested in the most, which players you think are locks. Put it in the comments, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. We'll be back with more Dynasty Redraft, Best Ball, and of course, Underdog Battle Royale content from Tyler in the very near future. Let's have a winning week.